Hello my fellow fantasy fans, and welcome to a video made on an auspicious day. I usually hate it when people date their videos because I care about the content and I don't want to lose immersion by thinking, oh, this video was made 9 years ago. However, I'll make an exception today. It is March 4th, 2021, and that makes it my 30th birthday. Yes, and I will celebrate it with a gift, not to me, but to you guys. I want to thank all of you who have watched, liked, commented, and subscribed, because I have over 300 subscribers now and you deserve something awesome. And so today, we're going to talk about dwarves. Not just any dwarves, not Warhammer dwarves, not Warcraft dwarves, not Dragon Age or Shannara or even Elder Scrolls. Today I will speak of the dwarves that all modern fantasy dwarves are based upon, the dwarves of Middle-earth. However, that can be a misleading description despite its accuracy. While the dwarves of later fantasy media do take many of Tolkien's aspects, Tolkien dwarves have quite a number of differences when it comes to their lore. For instance, these dwarves do not hold beer, ale, or any alcoholic drink in high regard as you'd expect. They don't dislike strong drink, but they're not known for their brewmasters. In fact, they're more fond of song and food than drink. Tolkien's dwarves also don't have a heroic tradition like those in Warhammer or Warcraft, or particularly Forgotten Realms. Every dwarf that could be labeled great or mighty fought for their people amongst their people, or for vengeance of kin and home. Nain and Dain Ironfoot, Azagal, Thorin, Balin. Only Gimli son of Gloin can be truly called an independent dwarf hero, and yet even he fought for the safety of all Middle-earth, which of course includes the 7 clans of dwarves. The dwarves of Middle-earth are also not adverse to discussion, and rarely choose not to speak unlike their grim, more modern counterparts. Many dwarves actually love telling tales and speaking of whatever comes to mind, though they can still be quite grim and are known for being secretive of certain aspects of their culture, which is one reason why Tolkien doesn't talk too much about dwarves, is because Tolkien's histories are from an elvish perspective and they don't get a lot of info out of dwarves because while dwarves do love talking, they don't love talking about themselves when it comes to certain parts of their people and culture. So, as I said, they're also not known for being great engineers or inventors of technology. Yes, they're praised craftsmen, and Tolkien does allude to their crafts being more than just their stone halls and their steel crafting, such as the toys made in Erebor during the time before Smaug, but not to any great degree compared to other fantasy media. It is Sauron and Saruman that have great war machines and factories. Tolkien was avidly against modern technology, so of course it was his villains that used the fires of industry and not a goodly race such as dwarves. Speaking of which, however, Tolkien originally did actually make dwarves an evil race and servants of Morgoth. Yes, it was in his very early drafts, but it was only when he wrote The Hobbit that he actually showed dwarves in a sympathetic light. And truth be told, they still were not that sympathetic. Most dwarves in The Hobbit were greedy, they split hairs, they were described as not being heroic, they only fought when there was no other choice, and they often relied on Bilbo and Gandalf to save the day. True, a few of the dwarves did have their moments, and Thorin was shown to be competent in most cases, but it was still early in Tolkien's career in his legendarium. That and the fact that it was made to be a children's book, and therefore he made them more of a caricature than he would in his later works, but still. In fact, turning them sympathetic was so strange that a Tolkien scholar, I believe it was Dr. Flieger, said 13 dwarves showing up at Bilbo's doorstep was as unlikely as 13 goblin wolf riders coming to the Shire looking for a burglar to hire. And last but not least, dwarves did not always favor the axe, and I don't believe there was any mention of a dwarf wielding a hammer ever, actually. The dwarves in The Hobbit had no weapons to speak of, and when they did, they didn't complain about using swords, even swords of elvish make. The 500 dwarf soldiers of the Iron Hills that followed Dain, who came to the Lonely Mountain in defense of Thorin, they wielded great mattocks and had shields and short, broad-bladed swords as secondary weapons. No one except Dain himself wielded an axe that day. That's not to say that axes were uncommon. Gimli used exclusively axes, and during the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, the entire dwarven host of Belegost wielded axes. They just weren't as common as in other media. Hell, Telkar, the greatest dwarven craftsman, and perhaps the greatest craftsman ever, save maybe Fëanor, never made a famous axe. Among his creations were the dragon helm of Azagal, Angrist, the knife wielded by Beren, and Narsil, which became Anduril, the Flame of the West, wielded by Aragorn at the end of the Third Age. Now, though Tolkien wrote extensively of all races, he described dwarves the least. Elves and men had his greatest focus, and later hobbits. Even the dwarves of The Hobbit were background characters for the most part, so we have little to go on and almost nothing to go on from a dwarven perspective. That said, let us take a deeper dive into the origins and history of the dwarves. Though Eru Ilúvatar knew of their coming since the beginning, they were not a part of his original will. Now, some call the Valar of Crafts Aule, but I've always called him Eul. I know that might grate on you, but that's just always what I've said. Either way, the Valar of Crafts was impatient for elves and men, and he wished to have subjects to teach and guide his children. So he made the dwarves. Though as soon as he made them, Eru knew of this rebellion and went to rebuke Aule. The dwarves did not yet have souls, and were only playthings of Eul. I know I keep coming back and forth, I'm sorry. Though Eul wished for them to have free will as he did. Eul knew of his folly, not adhering to Eru's will, and went to destroy his creations, only for them to recoil in fear. For with Eol's humbleness came the blessing of Ilúvatar, and he gave them souls. However, both Ilúvatar and Yavanna, Eol's wife and the Valar of trees and forests, said his creations would have conflict with the others, which is the beginning of the enmity between dwarves and elves, at least in a mythological point of view. That comes later. Now, Eru Ilúvatar blessed Aule, back and forth, for his humbleness, but his original rebellion would not be rewarded, so he made the dwarves fall asleep once more until after the elves had been born, and so around 100 years after the first elf had awoken, the dwarves awoke in full. Now, there were the dwarves called the Petty Dwarves, who had no teachings from the original 7 fathers of the dwarves, and they were so debased and unbecoming that the elves hunted them like animals, for they believed that that was all they were. For the dwarves awoke in the east, as elves had and as men would, and so the first to travel west to the land of Beleriand were the exiled Petty Dwarves. It was only when the true dwarves arrived that there was actually a first contact as we know it. I'll now read a section from the Silmarillion describing the first contact. The Silmarillion is an elvish history, as I said, edited by men, but these few pages are crucial to understanding the beginnings of dwarves and their role in the early ages of Middle-earth. Let me just look at my Silmarillion here. It came to pass during the second age of the captivity of Melkor that dwarves came over the blue mountains of Ered Luin into Beleriand. Themselves they named Khazad, but the Sindar called them Naugrim, the stunted people, and Gonhirim, masters of stone. Far to the east were the most ancient dwellings of the Naugrim, but they had delved for themselves great halls and mansions, after the manner of their kind, in the eastern side of Ered Luin, and those cities were named in their own tongue Gabilgathal and Tumunzahar. To the north of the great height of Mount Dolmed was Gabilgathal, which the elves interpreted in their tongue Belagast, that is Mickelberg in the human tongue, and southward was delved Tumunzahar by the elves named Nogrod, the Hollowbold. Greatest of all the mansions of the dwarves was Khazad-dûm, the Dwarodelf, had Hadrond in the elvish tongue, that was afterwards in its darkness called Moria. But it was far off in the mountains of mist beyond the wide leagues of Eriador, and to the Eldar came but as a name and a rumor from the words of the dwarves of the Blue Mountains. From Nogrod and Belagast the Naugrim came forth into Beleriand, and the elves were filled with amazement, for they had believed themselves to be the only living things in Middle-earth that spoke with words or wrought with hands, and that all others were but birds and beasts. But they could understand no word of the tongue of the Naugrim, which to their ears was cumbrous and unlovely. And few ever of the Eldar had achieved the mastery of it, but the dwarves were swift to learn, and indeed were more willing to learn the elven tongue than to teach their own to those of alien race. Few of the Eldar went ever to Nogrod and Belagast, save Eol of Nan Elmoth and Maiglin his son. But the dwarves trafficked into Beleriand, and they made a great road that passed under the shoulders of Mount Dolmed, and followed the course of the river Ascar, crossing Gillian at Sarn Athrad, the Ford of Stones, where battle after befell. Ever cool was the friendship between the Naugrim and the Eldar, though much profit they had of one another. But at that time those griefs that lay between them had not yet come to pass, and King Thingol welcomed them. But the Naugrim gave their friendship more readily to the Noldor in after days than to any others of elves and men, because of their love and reverence of Aule, and the gems of the Noldor they praised above all other wealth. In the darkness of Arda already the dwarves wrought great works, for even from the first days of their fathers they had marvelous skill with metals and with stone, but in that ancient time iron and copper they loved to work, rather than silver or gold. Now Melian had much foresight, after the manner of the Maiar, for when the second age of the captivity of Melkor had passed, she counseled Thingol that the peace of Arda would not last forever. He took thought, therefore, how he should make himself a kingly dwelling, and a place that should be strong, if evil were to awake again in Middle-earth, and he sought aid and counsel of the dwarves of Belagast. They gave it willingly, for they were unwearied in those days and eager for new works, and though the dwarves ever demanded a price for all that they did, whether with delight or with toil, at this time they held themselves paid. For Melian taught them much that they were eager to learn, and Thingol rewarded them with many fair pearls. These Círdan gave to him, and for they were got in great number in the shallow waters above the Isle of Balar. But the Naugrim, the dwarfs, have not ever before seen their like, and they held them dear. One there was as great as a dove's egg, and its sheen was as starlight on the foam of the sea. Nymphalos, as it was named, and the chieftain of the dwarves of Belagos prized it above a mountain of wealth. Therefore the Naugrim labored long and gladly for Thingol, and devised for him mansions after the fashion of their people, delved deep into the earth, where the Esgalduin flowed down and parted Neldaroth from Oregion. There rose in the midst of the forest a rocky hill, and the river ran at its feet. There they made the gates of the hall of Thingol, and they built a bridge of stone over the river, by which alone the gates could be entered. Beyond the gates wide passages ran down to high halls and chambers far below that were hewn into the living stone, so many and so great that the dwelling was named Menegroth, the 1,000 Caves. But the elves also had part in their labor, and elves and dwarves together, each with their own skill, were wrought out the visions of Melian, images of the wonder and beauty of Valinor beyond the sea. The pillars of Menegroth were hewn into the likeness of the beaches of Orome, stock, bow, and leaf, and they were lit with lanterns of gold. The nightingales sang there as the gardens of Lorien, and there were fountains of silver, basins of marble, and floors of many-colored stones. Carven figures of beasts and birds ran upon the walls, or climbed upon the pillars, or peered among the branches entwined with many flowers, and as the years passed, Melian and her maidens filled the halls with woven hangings wherein could be read the deeds of the Valar, and many things that had befallen in Arda since its beginning, and shadows of things that were not yet to be. That was the fairest dwelling of any king that has ever been east of the sea. And when the building of Menegroth was achieved, and there was peace in the realm of Thingol and Melian, the Naugrim, the dwarves, yet came ever and anon over the mountains, and went in traffic about the lands. But they seldom went to the Falas, for they hated the sound of the sea and feared to look upon it. To Beleriand there came no other rumor or tidings of the world without. But as the third age of the captivity of Melkor drew on, the dwarves became troubled, and they spoke to King Thingol, saying that the Valar had not rooted out utterly the evils of the north, and now the remnant, having long multiplied in the dark, were coming forth once more and roaming far and wide. There are fell beasts, the dwarves said, in the land east of the mountains, and your ancient kindred that dwell there are flying from the plains to the hills. And ere long the evil creatures came even to Beleriand, over passes in the mountains, or up from the south through dark forests. Wolves there were, or creatures that walked in wolf shapes, and other fell beings of shadow, and among them were the orcs, who afterwards wrought ruin in Beleriand, but they were yet few and wary, and did but smell out the ways of the land, awaiting the return of their lord. Whence they came or what they were, the elves knew not then, thinking them perhaps to be Avari who had become evil and savage in the wild, in which they guessed all too near, it is said. Therefore Thingol took thought for arms, which before his people he had not needed, and these at first, the Naugrim, dwarves, smithied for him, for they were greatly skilled in such work, though none among them surpassed the craftsmen of Nogrod, of whom Telkar the smith was greatest in renown, Telkar who I spoke of earlier. A warlike race of old were the Naugrim, the dwarves, and they would fight fiercely against whomsoever aggrieved them, servants of Melkor, or Eldar, or Avari, or wild beasts, or not seldom their own kin, dwarves of other mansions and lordships. Their smithcraft indeed the Sindar soon learned of them, yet in the tempering of steel alone of all crafts, the dwarves were never outmatched even by the Noldor, and in the making of mail and linked rings, which was first contrived by the smiths of Belagast, their work had no rival. At this time, therefore, the Sindar were well armed, and they drove off the creatures of evil, and had peace again. But Thingol's armories were stored with axes and with spears and swords, and tall helms, and long coats of bright mail. For the hauberks of the dwarves were so fashioned that they rusted not, but shone ever as if they were newly burnished. And that proved well for Thingol in that time that was to come. So as you can see from that passage, the dwarves first gave the elves of Middle-earth arms and armor, and they brought news. And they fashioned great works by the behest of Thingol and Melian. Now, also as stated in the passage, the dwarves have always been the toughest of the free peoples. In fact, technically their bodies give them the greatest natural longevity of any other peoples, disregarding the Ents and the like. Yes, the elves are immortal, but they are immortal because time does not touch them as it does others. The men of Numenor were blessed to receive their long life, but the dwarves, counting their lifespans in centuries, still feel the full ravage of time and bear its brunt, as they bear many ills. Aule made them hardy and stout, to better resist Morgoth and his minions. In fact, Tolkien describes them as the most redoubtable people in Middle-earth, and the ones you would least like to make an enemy of, for dwarves are tough warriors who hold grudges and have strong bonds of kinship. As an example, the dwarves of the Third Age, as all peoples in Middle-earth, were less powerful than their forebears, and yet despite the mighty foes they faced, they fought tooth and nail for every inch of ground. When the nameless Balrog appeared in Moria, which would later become Durin's Bane, the creature surprised the kingdom and slew Durin the Sixth, though it is to be said that Durin the Sixth was an incredibly old dwarf then. He was 249 years of age, and most dwarves only lived to be 250. And despite the great demons slaying their king and attacking from the dwarves' weakest point, the conquest did not happen overnight. It took an entire year for the Balrog and the orcs, or those orcs that drove in from when the dwarves were fighting the Balrog, to drive the dwarves out of the tunnels. It was also the War of the Dwarves and Dragons, for the wingless, fireless dragons, though they were still huge and dangerous, had multiplied and grown strong once more in the cold wastes. They descended upon the dwarves of the Grey Mountains, and though the dwarves were under the curse of their rings and they fought against a massive army of dragons, it took nearly 20 years to make the dwarves migrate south to the Iron Hills and the Lonely Mountain, establishing the kingdom of Erebor. Though it is to be said that the Balrog and the dragons, though powerful and committing heinous acts, never actually insulted the dwarves. We saw what happened when the dwarves were truly insulted, when Azog the Orc King killed an elderly Thror, cut his head off, branded his name upon the head, and tossed it to his companion Nar outside of the gates of Moria. The orc further insulted all dwarves by giving Nar a bag of coins, treating him like a beggar and telling him to go and tell all dwarves who truly ruled in their ancient city of Khazad-dûm. And when Nar fled, he saw the goblins come out of the gate and hack apart what was left of Thror's body, feeding the scraps to the birds. Let's compare this to the Great Oath of Feanor, the greatest craftsman of the elves and the leader of the Noldorin exiles. When Morgoth destroyed the trees and fled Valinor, and the Silmarils were lost, Feanor made an oath and called the elves to go to Middle-earth for vengeance. Only a portion of the Noldor followed him, whilst the entirety of the Vanyar and Teleri and many Noldor did not heed his call. However, when Thror was killed by Azog and the dwarves insulted, the entirety of the dwarves in Middle-earth rose up and performed the first true act of genocide done by a goodly race. Systematically, one by one, the armies of the dwarves slew orc tribe after orc tribe until all fled in their wake. Before, at the Battle of Azanul Bazar, Azog was slain by Dane Ironfoot and the orcs were scattered. It would be almost 150 years before the orcs of the mountains regained enough strength to be a menace once more, and for a race that reputedly breeds so rapidly, that's an incredible feat. Also, let us not forget the dwarves of the Second Age that sallied forth from Khazad-dûm to ruin Sauron's conquest of Eriador, gaining his eternal enmity and hatred, and the dwarves of the First Age, who were truly powerful to behold. Yes, we don't get any mention of great dwarf heroes, since the Legendarium does not focus on dwarf deeds, but we do get very cool glimpses of their actions. At the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, the dwarves actually came out the best of the battle. It was the dwarves who held off the father of all dragons, Glaurung, to save the elven host, and though Glaurung mortally wounded their king Azogol, Azogol in turn maimed the great dragon with such a blow with just a knife that he would not be seen again for another 23 years. And though we get no records of great dwarf heroes slaying Balrogs as we do great elven heroes, though it is to be said that any elven hero, or anyone who's actually ever fought a Balrog, has died in the attempt, you know, the elven heroes still slew Balrogs, so credit where credit's due. You do need to notice that when the dwarves saw their king fall, everyone, including the Balrogs in Morgoth's army, got the hell out of their way. So while I didn't get too in-depth into the minute details of Tolkien's Dwarven lore, I truly hope you enjoyed the video. If you'd like to support me, likes and subscriptions always help. But if you could give me a tip on coffee, or better yet, order my new fantasy novella, Pool of Wailing Sorrows, I just made a trailer for it, I'll give links below. Even if you don't, I hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks, and I'll see you guys again soon.